All right. Hi, everybody, and welcome. My name is Laurel Glenn. I'm the program manager for safety here at the Virginia Tech Transportation Institute. And I'm very happy that you decided to join us for our last webinar in our series, which is this time a review of Micromobility Regulation Best Practices. You've all come into this meeting muted with your cameras off. We're going to have everybody remain muted until the question and answer session, during which if you want to go ahead and have your mic opened up, you can just raise your hand and I will open that up during that time. Captions will be on for your convenience, and videos, again, will remain off just for preserving bandwidth, etc. If you do have any questions during the webinar, feel free to go ahead and type them down in the chat box below. And then they're going to be addressed at the end during the question and answer session. Again, you can also just ask to have your mic unblocked, and we will do that as well. We are recording the webinar, and that recording will be available to everyone within a week or less. So at this time, I'd like to introduce today's presenter. Gretchen Stoeltje is a doctor of law and an associate research scientist at TTI, where she focuses on legal and policy implications of emerging mobility technologies and effective communication strategies. Gretchen has led several projects at TTI, notably a project for Texas DOT assessing potential tort liability for state DOTs stemming from CAV deployment, and in partnership with Stantec, a collaboration between the Texas A&M School of Law and TTI to develop a program in transportation law. Gretchen has also led 2 legal research projects in this particular group, which is this center, the Safety Through Disruption Center, as well as numerous complex cross-disciplinary tasks that involve the conversion of research findings into multimedia deliverables. So I'm going to turn over to Gretchen now for our presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Laurel. Thank you so much for setting up this webinar and hosting it today. As Laurel said, I am at TTI. I have been there about 10 years now, and lately have been focusing a lot on emerging technology law in transportation. As you probably know, SAFED is a university transportation center, and it's a consortium between San Diego State University, Texas A&M, and Virginia Tech. So welcome to today's safety webinar. Our project is called Micromobility Regulation Best Practices Review. Easier to remember, Scoot Now, Regulate Later, which seemed to be the theme of micromobility deployment. My team members from TTI were Todd Hansen, Billy Wong, and Tina Geiselbrecht. And we have become a lean and mean legal research super team. So if you know these folks or have a chance to meet them, congratulate them on an amazing job. So today's agenda is that I'll go over the project overview, just like super high level scope and questions, our methodology, our findings, and recommendations for future research. The project overview was, we really ended up focusing on e-scooters and e-scooters in shared use rental fleets, not privately owned e-scooters. And we kept our scope to the United States because that's the most comparable context for everybody's separate regulatory schemes. The big question that I had and still have is, what is the relationship, if any, between e-scooter regulation, safety, and legal liability? That's a broad question that I think can sort of be directed in 3 different directions. One is towards a government or municipality direction. So like their responsibility for creating effective traffic laws, effective education and outreach of those laws, appropriate infrastructure design and maintenance. A second direction for safe responsibility for safety would be users or riders. So knowledge of safe operation, regulatory compliance, and then of course the source of a scooter, operators responsible for maintenance, and then behind them in the stream of commerce, design and manufacture, and safe design and manufacture and proper instruction. So those are kind of the three directions we began to look for who's responsible legally and otherwise for e-scooter safety operation. We'll revisit kind of those questions in a minute, but I'll go over the methodology next. So I'll say that this project suffered some COVID-related setbacks, so we weren't really able to complete it as originally planned. However, we did get through at least the first three tasks, and I think we created some amazing foundation for future research. So the literature review was designed to identify the safety regulations that municipalities and regions have imposed on micromobility options. As I said, the review is national in scope, and the literature under review included published works and articles and publicly available sources. We anticipated that safety risks could fall into into several categories. So as I mentioned before, e-scooter design, manufacture, operator knowledge and ability, or rider knowledge and ability, effective traffic laws that are effectively communicated, and safe infrastructure design and maintenance. So we sought to identify what regulatory strategies are available to address these categories and whose responsibility it may be to address and ensure compliance with those safety issues. Next, we did jurisdiction selection. So the purpose of this task was to identify examples of different regulatory approaches that jurisdictions in the US have taken to address e-scooter safety. We identified 7 jurisdictions on which to focus, and we'll go over those in more detail. They were Los Angeles, Portland, San Francisco, Chicago, Dallas, Miami, and Bellevue, Washington. And we selected those based on several sets of attributes and sub-attributes that represented a range of regulatory approaches. Some were very restrictive, others more permissive, some more reactive, others more proactive. And then finally, we did a legal and regulatory inventory and analysis. So first, we examined federal regulations governing e-scooters, then moved to the state laws in the states where each chosen municipality is located. We then moved down to the local level and captured and inventoried the regulations of each chosen jurisdiction. So we identified and categorized the components of each set of regulations to create a typology of regulatory terms and approaches. We identified how safety has been addressed in each specific jurisdiction and where regulators have delegated responsibility for safe operation. Researchers also examined the efforts of each jurisdiction to inform citizens of new or existing e-scooter laws. For example, in some jurisdictions, vendors inform users of relevant e-scooter traffic safety laws in-app. In other jurisdictions, users may be expected to know the law without any targeted efforts to inform them. And where relevant, we examined the terms of the permits issued to service providers, terms of use that users agree to, and what levels of design immunity that the jurisdiction is afforded in its local or state laws. So back to the big research question, which we broke down into 10 smaller research questions. In an effort to really understand this relationship between e-scooter safety risks and regulation that could target those risks. So the first question was, what are the safety issues associated with e-scooters? Particularly, what is not only what are the nature of the injuries that people are sustaining, and who are those people? Riders, motor vehicle drivers, pedestrians. Not only injury, but what's the cause of the injury? What incident occurred to to create the injury, and why did that incident occur? Was it equipment failure? Was it user lack of knowledge or experience? Was it a poorly maintained street whose potholes were too big for scooters? What are the real issues that need to be known before a regulation can be targeted to a particular issue, right? So that was the first question that we were looking for data on to be able to really direct ourselves. Next was, what are the safety issues that regulators have addressed in new or existing e-scooter safety regulation? The third was, what are there state laws in place that restrict or otherwise affect a municipality's ability to regulate e-scooters? Are municipalities preempted from regulating e-scooters? Fourth was, what type of regulations are municipalities and regions using to address these matters? So, for example, do they address rider education and licensing, traffic law requirements like helmet laws, drunk driving laws, geofencing for restricted areas? What about compliance, standards compliance for the e-scooters themselves? And then street and infrastructure design. What are the guidelines or the duties and or the immunities around that? Fifth was, were new or existing regulations communicated to e-scooters, and if so, how? Our sixth question, well, maybe not sixth, maybe it's more like ninth or 10th. What experience do jurisdictions report regarding enforcement of their regulations? And do regulators believe that their regulations have had an effect on e-scooter safety in their jurisdiction? So we'd hoped that question number one would lead us to very scooter-specific safety or crash or injury data that would enable us to narrow the rest of the questions accordingly. We were looking for, what, as I said, what kind of injuries are occurring, from what kind of incidents, and what was the cause of the incident. So if we could find data on the nature of safety or risk, we could then narrow our search to really look at those particular regulations that address those. At the time, however, there were we could really only find 2 reports on e-scooter injury safety at all. One was from the Austin Public Health Department in conjunction with the CDC, and the other was from, I believe, Los Angeles emergency room doctors who had taken their own data and looked at some other data from 2014 to 2018 about the nature of injuries coming into ER rooms, and same with the Austin study. But they weren't comprehensive. That's not the job of ER doctors to investigate crashes. And so we weren't really able to target, we had some sense of the injuries, but not really able to target the cause of the incident and accordingly trace whether regulations were targeting those causes. They're subsequent to most of our project, other reports have come in, and we'll go over their findings towards the end. But just to let you know, when we started this, we didn't find the data that we really needed to kind of figure out which direction or directions needed best targeting for regulation. So at that point, since we didn't have the safety data we needed, we really kept our perspective broad and went ahead with documentation of a wide range of e-scooter safety risks and regulatory approaches. The major categories you see here are injuries and fatalities and causes of harm, and I'll get into that a little bit more later. Regulatory authority, so what federal, state, and local regulations were at play and how they work together. E-scooter equipment safety, so design and manufacture and maintenance of the scooters themselves. Non-regulatory measures like infrastructure design and condition, outreach, educational outreach to users. Regulatory measures that cities and states take, like age limit for license requirements, helmet laws, traffic and parking laws, and then government liability, covering issues like insurance, requirements, indemnity and liability waivers. And so this was the very broad range of areas of regulation and regulatory matters that we ended up looking at for these 7 jurisdictions. And so kind of based on the reporting that we were getting out of the literature about cities that were actively grappling with e-scooters and addressing and incorporating them into their systems, we created a list of municipalities that would be the focus of a review of regulations and policies, and developed a selection criteria based on attributes that surfaced in the literature characterizing programmatic and regulatory approaches that cities were taking in incorporating scooters. So and for each attribute, there's a range of sub-attributes afterwards. And the goal was to select cities such that between all of the municipalities, all of the attributes and the sub-attributes would be represented. So the first level of attributes and the criteria you can see listed on the left. We looked at levels of restriction, geographic part of, geography, where in the country was it, pilot, whether there was a pilot phase or simply just deployment, whether there were banned or restricted areas in a municipality, what the permit processes were like, were there caps on fleet size in a city, what were the data agreements, were there data sharing, were there data requirements once permitting had begun, and then any safety analyses that the cities gathered and made available. And so that was the high level. And as I said a minute ago, each of those attributes has sub-attributes. And so once we kind of crunched all of that stuff, we arrived at this list of 7 cities that you see here on the right. Los Angeles, Chicago, Dallas, San Francisco, Portland, Miami, and Bellevue, Washington. So I'll go into the regulatory findings a little bit. At the federal level, at least at the time that we finished this project, e-scooters were regulated by the United States Consumer Product Safety Commission. So micromobility devices are not considered motor vehicles subject to NHTSA's regulatory requirements. They more closely resemble low-speed electric bicycles, and those are regulated by CPSC. And they should meet product and safety standards. However, to date, or by the date we finished this project, the CPSC had not released any mandatory or voluntary safety standards or guidelines that states and municipalities can refer to when determining the types of e-scooter devices to allow in their communities. So that's a big burden on municipalities right there, to have to be responsible for, figuring out which device they feel safe with. At the state level, either there were no statutes governing e-scooters explicitly, or they were inconsistent, as state laws tend to be on everything. And state traffic laws, and so generally state traffic laws and vehicle codes govern the operation of micromobility devices on streets, trails, and bikeways within a state through, by authorizing local governments to regulate the devices through permits that allow them on the public right-of-way within their jurisdiction. Local governments may also have the authority to differentiate among the types of available devices and establish definitions for devices. Some states give explicit authority to local governments to regulate micromobility options, shared systems, or both, and others, such as Colorado, had to reclassify micromobility devices statutorily from one type of product to another in order to subject them to state local vehicle codes. So as usual, things differ state to state. with transportation, and micromobility is not that different. And then locally, in the literature on this regulation, we found that local governments and their agencies are identified as directly responsible for ensuring the safety of shared mobility program users micromobility program users, because unlike federal or state governments, they generally have jurisdiction over management of the public right-of-way within their geographic boundaries where micromobility devices are used. Local governments in the form of counties and municipalities are generally provided authority under state law for regulating the use of micromobility devices, and in most cases own and manage the infrastructure where the devices are used, parked, and accessed. So in these cases, municipalities and operators reach agreements on the terms of deployment before e-scooters are placed within the public right-of-way in an area. That was after they sort of arrived. That was after they were surprised by their overnight arrival in some jurisdictions. Permitting can be accomplished through a right-of-way permitting scheme or as part of a pilot or demonstration program. And permitting is an existing regulatory process that allows cities to set standards for micromobility equipment, including model features like motor wattage, maximum speed, maximum weight, battery limits, and safety equipment like lights and reflectors, acoustic devices, identification plates. Permits can also be revoked and renewed fairly easily by cities. Typically, local governments require private shared mobility companies to obtain a license or an administrative permit for use of the public right-of-way in the same way utility companies acquire permits to build and maintain utility infrastructure in the right-of-way. So some very high-level findings that we were able to make based on the data that we found and that was publicly available to us, and not because we ended up talking to these cities yet, were just very, very high-level findings on injuries and incidents over a few years of their own experience with them. And this is not apples to apples, like these were their own reports that were not made in conjunction with each other. So regarding injuries and incidents, Los Angeles, we found two reports, one from LA DOT and one from California Highway Patrol. They reported 407 collisions. They had one fatality, and in that case, the person who died was not wearing a helmet. And they reported no identifiable trend about safety, risk, particular approach. In San Francisco, they reported 32 injuries. They characterized their 12% helmet use as low. They reported that injuries had decreased since their permitting approach had begun. Chicago reported 171 ER visits in the second year that they were reporting on. Their helmet use for people who reported using helmets often was 9%. And they noted that their ER visits had decreased from the prior year from 192 down to 171. Portland reported no fatalities and low helmet use, and they did observe that private scooter owners tend to wear helmets and renters do not. Neither Dallas nor Miami published any safety data, not that we found in our study period. And Bellevue reported 2 collisions, and they didn't have anything to say about helmet use, and operators in that city reported 0 incidents. So we at least can see that helmet use seems to be an issue. That's not really surprising, just sort of from an anecdotal perspective from reading the newspaper or watching people around your own town. So this was kind of like the highest level, most concentrated data we could find from cities about safety during the period that we were looking at it. However, we did gather an enormous range of local regulatory information. We created really robust and detailed matrices that compared and inventoried a number of areas of regulation that can easily be considered safety. So we looked at vehicle equipment definitions, we looked at permitting, licensing, caps on fleet size, permit administration and renewal fees and application fees, insurance requirements, vehicle requirements, like ID numbers, lights, sounds, mechanical features on the vehicle itself or the equipment, technical requirements like whether things were GPS equipped, speed limited, photo validation able, geofencing, whether sidewalk writing could be detected, customer education, whether safe operating and parking instructions, state or local laws, riding on sidewalks, how all those helmet use, how all of those rules were communicated, definitions of violation and enforcement and the enforcing agency in any given city, areas that were banned. Almost all cities banned scooters on sidewalks. Rules on operating and parking. There were extensive restrictions and fees for violating those rules. And there was an emphasis on equity and opportunity zones, so access requirements for certain parts of certain cities. And then data requirements. There were submission requirements for a city's mobility data specification, or most had device location data in real time made available to a municipality. And then the safety analysis that I've summarized here. So we collected a huge amount of regulatory information that I think much of which has safety implications. So we laid a really amazing foundation for asking these questions. We revisited the safety portion of the literature review after we had completed almost everything that we did, because data had become available during the course of the project. So at the start of this project, we only had sort of unreliably and scarcely reported safety and injury data. By the close of 2022, which is when we were sort of finishing writing this, several reports were published that provided really useful information. So unlike the initial literature review performed for this report, the recent safety data findings summarize injury and fatality findings primarily from the so this section of our project summarizes more newly available reports that would have been helpful to have when we had started the project 2 years before. There was a report from the US CPSC called Micromobility Products, Related Deaths, Injuries, and Hazard Patterns. There was one from the Behavioral Traffic Safety Cooperative Research Program called E-Scooter Safety, Issues and Solutions. And then one from the Insurance Institute for Highway Safety. So finally now, I think we're starting to see a picture emerge. None of this was sort of coordinated and conclusive, but there is now a lot more to say about not only injury types, but causes of, what happened, what was the event that caused the injury, and then why did that event happen. So I'm going to sort of just read a little bit out of our report to give you a sense of what we know now. So the CPSC report found that most of these micromobility related injuries were attributable to unspecified falls and other notable hazards leading to injuries including loss of control, collisions with vehicles, and pavement issues. From a 2019 study also found that some of the causes of those injuries were failure to use a helmet and lack of rider experience. Another older study shows that vehicle speed, rider intoxication, condition of infrastructure, and suitableness of infrastructure for scooter use were issues. Collisions with pedestrians, bicyclists, another scooter, swerving, stopping, or jumping off the scooter to avoid a collision, being doored by a vehicle, falling off the device due to road hazards like potholes and uneven pavement, falling off the vehicle due to defective or malfunctioning devices. The BTS CRP study found that the literature reports a large proportion of e-scooter injuries that result from single vehicle crashes and falling off on roadways, sidewalks, and bike lanes. Infrastructure surface conditions were commonly cited as crash factors. Hardware failure or malfunction was found to be an additional contributor to e-scooter related injuries, and as was rider inexperience. E-scooter crashes with pedestrians made up a small percentage of incidents and may be attributed to conflicts created by sidewalk riding or the lack of safe alternatives to e-scooter travel. Fatalities got much more into the vehicles themselves. So of the 68 fatalities associated with e-scooters, and this is between 2017 and 2021, 49 were due to motor vehicle crashes. 9 fatalities were due to user control issues that led to crashing into fixed objects like trees or colliding with other riders, striking road curbs, getting thrown into oncoming traffic. 2 fatalities were associated with e-scooter related fires started while charging. 2 fatalities resulted from pedestrians who were struck by e-scooter riders. 1 fatality was associated with intoxication, and another involved a crash with a commuter train. The CPSC report linked product-related hazards with 48 of the 68 fatalities associated with e-scooters, including brake problems, fire hazards while charging, and unexpected power loss that caused riders to tip over or get thrown off. And finally, as you probably noted, the literature is consistent regarding the most common type of micromobility related injury, which is lower extremity and head injuries. This was more common among e-scooter riders than among cyclists, probably because e-scooter riders are less likely to wear helmets. So, as you can see, I didn't get all of my questions answered. We only got so far. As I said, we had some COVID-related setbacks and didn't start really with the data that we thought we would find when we began the project. So if I were starting this today, I would, these are my recommendations for future research. I would continue looking for detailed data on exact causes of crashes and injuries and fatalities to understand whose act or failure to act were the actual causes of the incident and what can be done and by whom to prevent those acts or omissions in the future. To get that data, I think I would be hoping to have, besides doing a lot of Googling, having guided discussions with city officials and operators. I think a nationwide scan of any lawsuits filed would be instructive to figure out what the causes are of injury and what the allegations are for those causes, what were the causes of the causes. Insurance requirements. I think discussions with insurance providers would be remarkably helpful to understand where liability is assumed to lie. A closer examination of terms of use and liability the terms of use that users agree to. So a deeper and more comparative analysis of those service agreements. User knowledge of regulations. I would love to do a focus group with writers to understand where they get their education about what the requirements are for safe operation of scooters when they rent them. And then infrastructure harmonization, looking at whether all of our vehicular infrastructure is appropriate for e-scooters or not. I would hold guided discussions with federal regulators and with infrastructure designers. So as you can see, endless curiosity, never enough time. But this was really fascinating. I'm still really curious about, as I said, the relationship between safety and liability, and motive for being liable. It sort of based on where liability is assigned for these new types of mobility. I think that's all I had planned to say. I welcome any questions.
All right, thank you very much for all that. I'm just gonna kind of ask one, due to the fact that you're, up on the research and everything of that nature. When you were looking at stuff, was anything ever mentioned about, we have a someone who's asking about the, what do you call this? The depth sensors for even like scooters, for example, or any type of micromobility, and that may be playing a part when you were talking about crashes and sidewalk riding and things of that nature. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Let me just clarify. When you say depth sensors, are you talking about the depth of a surface's irregularities?
Like, I think, and Laura, you can correct me if I'm wrong, about the curbs coming on and off, or any kind of, maybe perhaps as well irregularity in the sidewalks, but I think maybe perhaps more like a fast drops or fast rises and things of that nature.
We have a beautiful table on equipment. We have a beautiful table. We have so many beautiful tables. You're welcome. You're welcome to use them all. I don't remember depth sensors in particular, but I imagine that you're probably getting at a question of sort of infrastructure appropriateness for these vehicles, and whether how flexible you can be with them, what surfaces they can safely ride on, whether they can warn a rider of an irregularity coming up. And I don't know the answer to your question, but I think for me it gets to the lack of federal sort of vehicle standards for scooters. Most of them apparently are all built in one factory, but one can order different features on different scooters depending on who one is, fleet owner operator. And so again, like, cities leaving these sort of vehicle standards and what they can do to cities, to me, seems really burdensome. This could have changed in the last year and I just didn't notice. But if it's still the case that there can be this range of ability on a vehicle, I don't know how. I think it would be really burdensome for a city to figure out where they're going to allow or disallow a scooter to ride, if they don't know what it's capable of sensing.
Okay, thank you. Another question is, were there any jurisdictions that you weren't able to look into during this project that you would like to look into possibly in the future you want to?
One, we didn't have as an attribute cities who had initially banned them and then brought them back. it is possible that one of our cities did that, but that's not, we hadn't looked for that, specifically. That's a question I would like to ask a city. If you had banned it initially, why? And what changed that allowed you to feel comfortable coming up with a way of deploying again? And what mechanism did you use for that? Assuming it was maybe it was a limited pilot and you gathered data. Maybe it was a permit that would have sufficed had they approached you initially. What changed that made you comfortable and able to deploy them in your city? I'd love to talk to Paris. I think they just banned them, but they're not a super typical. They're not a very typical American city. So,
Okay. We have a question from Jim, stating he assumes that fleet scooters are expected to behave more or less like bicycles. So do you have any sense of how often police were engaged with enforcing rules of the road with micromobility users, like riding with traffic? And was any kind of non-compliant behavior implicated in any of the crashes that you were able to review?
I feel like, and I didn't re-review this for this webinar, but I feel like if I trusted my memory, it would tell me that there isn't very much information on enforcement. It's too hard for it's just sort of impractical for cops to be able to prioritize scooters, whether they even know what the laws are themselves, because they're new and they haven't been well codified. I feel like we just didn't find very much information, and that anecdotally, we were hearing that there just wasn't very much enforcement. Could be wrong about that, but I don't think so.
Again, I think this was just for your thought of your knowledge and discussion. A statement about would there not be some similar issues that you're seeing here with the micromobility with e-scooters when we're starting to permit, or if we do start permitting sidewalk robots for security or for delivery or anything of that nature as well?
Absolutely. The discussion today, I think, was more focused on rider safety, between riders and drivers. But one reason we had trouble finding a lot of safety specific data was that much of what people were regulating for were things like riding on sidewalks becoming hazards for pedestrians, for people in wheelchairs, for, of course, leaving their stuff everywhere, just leaving, scooters everywhere for people to trip over. That was much more of a visible concern, and the safety of other sidewalk users seemed to be a focus of early regulation. So I know that there must be, that would be a really great question to ask cities, that maybe you are a city asking. It would be a really great question to ask, how would you compare scooter regulation on sidewalks with delivery robot regulation as hazards, or at least as competitors on our sidewalks. Like I said, most cities that we looked at had banned e-scooters on sidewalks, but I'm sure if your city's like mine, people are using them anyway. So yeah, I think it's a really interesting question, who all gets to use a sidewalk and who not. Things like e-scooters, like I guess bikes are sort of the same. I feel like bikes are a little less tippy, but whether a bike is too fast a vehicle to share with pedestrians and other sidewalk users. Same with scooters. And I don't know, if not, should they be forced in the street? I don't know. It's a really interesting, we're so multimodal now. It's really hard to figure out how to design streets for everything.
Yeah, I'll say this on a just from my own experience. Also, maybe you're also looking at this too with the culture, right, of the mobility of choice. So, for example, I know that I'm an avid biker for transportation, and so here I am going through, town on my bicycle, and there's plenty of e-scooters around me, but they do not stop for pedestrians and
Mhm.
crosswalks. And I always feel like I've got to represent all bikers. We will stop, And I feel like, but what is the culture? Is there a culture coming up with the type of mobility that's in use as well? And discussing that, did you find in searching for like education that is required or for using these types of for using these e-scooters, what would be the strongest or the highest level of education that you saw versus I guess no education for the rider?
Well, I mean, I guess the most comprehensive and the most defensible would be whatever is in the app that you use to rent the scooter. There would be arguably, the most, so that would be the place where you could probably include the most comprehensive instructions for how to safely ride a scooter. In practice, I don't know how many people would actually read that. So I don't know how effective it would be. And that was another reason I really wanted to do focus groups, to ask people where they get their information. I mean, we saw in the report, we have pictures of posters that had been taped to like lampposts in LA that were just flyers explaining, some basic scooter education stuff. So, I mean, but some fleet owners were having events. I think people were looking for, interesting place to leave information based on who they think their riders are. So I don't know. I mean, I feel like if people actually ever read any of the things they clicked on, which are contracts, then in the app is where you would put it. I just don't know how much people use that.
We have another
Hire me,
comment.
I'll find out.
Yeah, you have some work to do. We do have another comment, which I think is important to share, which, that like I was stating about bicyclists versus e-scooters, of what I've just noted in my own personal experiences, that yes, as a bicyclist, we do have the same rules as motorists here, at least in my town we do. So we have to abide by those rules, like pedestrians and stuff like that. But again, where's that line where, the rules for the types of micromobility? And I think that is a good point. I don't think we do have an answer for that as well.
No, I mean, I think about this myself. Like, where would I feel like if I ever get back on my bike, I'm going to have to go down to REI and take like a cycling class so I can relearn some rules that I maybe learned when I was 7, about where I'm supposed to be when I'm on my bike, and I had a friend who was given a citation because she was riding on a sidewalk, as a very wide sidewalk on an incredibly busy, dangerous street, and there wasn't an alternative other than the sidewalk. And she said, well, thank you. I'm going to take your badge number so that when I die in the traffic, my mom will know who to call, like who told me to get back in the traffic with the cars. So I don't know. I mean, I feel like it's sometimes I mean, I don't live in a city I would really want to bike in, because it doesn't feel like, regardless of the laws, it doesn't feel particularly safe to me to be riding on streets.
I'm going to promote another safety project that we have for those of you who are interested. There is another safety project that did develop an educational program for cyclists, specifically for a college town. But if anyone is interested, you can go ahead and send a chat as well, and I can get that information for you and point you in the right direction. Are there any other? Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, nothing.
Okay. Oh, there are some more things. Let's see. Okay, any more questions? There's discussions going on. Are there any other questions for right now? We'll give a moment to that. In the meantime, while if someone's writing their last questions, I do want to thank everybody for joining this webinar, and thank you for giving your presentation for everybody and having this discussion. Like I said, I will have this recorded for YouTube, as well as the presentation that was shared today. They're all going to go on the project website, which if you have registered, that means I am, which you have if you're here, I'm going to be sending you within the week a email that will document the citation for this webinar, as well as a link to the video recording and to the PowerPoint presentation that was used.
Yeah, and I also want to, if you are interested in any of these findings about this or many of those other topics of e-scooter regulation that I mentioned, I really welcome you to go look at our amazing, you know, charts, graphs, matrices that we captured everything in. They're in the appendices of the report, so you have to get pretty far down, but it's pretty amazing. It's a pretty great foundation for asking questions either about the cities in the report or a way of approaching other jurisdictions and their regulatory schemes. So I hope other folks get some benefit out of them. I think they're incredibly robust and a really, really helpful start to seeing what people are trying to do.
All right, I am going to, in the chat right now, I'm dropping a link which goes to this project site. From there, you will also find the final report, so you can have that as well. And some more information of the work which she and her colleagues have done. I'm going to read something from Jim. Thank you. Writes, I recently wrote a micromobility policy analysis as a consultant, and in my national policy review found that best practice seems to be requiring micromobility devices, including things like e-skateboards. They should behave like bikes. We tried to codify it in the state law, but the state police didn't like the idea that we were in any way condoning the use of things like e-skateboards. Do you have any thoughts on that?
No, other than from a couple of other projects I've worked on, I think sometimes regulation and new definitions and new practices take as long a time to trickle down to agencies and law enforcement as they do to everyone else. I found that often law enforcement doesn't always understand what the regulations are, especially if they're not well written or if they're hidden in some weird part of the code where it's not easy to find. So I wonder if they just need to be better educated. I mean, I feel like I've been doing a couple of projects with law enforcement stuff lately, and that just like anyone else, when they don't, you know, understand something super well, they don't want to embrace it. And it's not hard to not understand changes in code, especially if you have to understand some interplay between state code and local regulations. So I don't have a sense about this particular mode, but I just wonder if, you know, someone taking the time to really explain it to them might make it easier for them to help enforce. But it's an interesting question.
Thank you for that. All right, I think we have hit all of our questions and discussions. Once again, Gretchen, I appreciate you taking the time to share all this information with us. And for everybody else, you will receive an email within a week with all the recordings. So thank you very much. And thank you for joining all the safety webinars that we've had over the few years. I know I've seen a number of names repeatedly week after week, and I or month after month. And I really am glad that we've been able to share all this information with all of you. So thank you all.
Thank you so much. Thanks everyone. And thank you, Laurel.
Mhm.